So in this first third of class, we're going to take a look at Islamic Central Asia, this region we've been avoiding since all the way back at the beginning of class when we talked about the ancient Persians. But Islamic Central Asia was nothing new in our period today. Persia and the Eurasian steppes, as far as the Indus Valley, you'll remember, came under Muslim rule a long time ago during the first 2 centuries of Islam. The architecture in this period, however, all the way from the 1400s to the 1700s, is truly something utterly unique. After the Ottomans, Central Asia produced the next flowering artistic expressions to enchant and move spectators in the Islamic world. But let's catch you up first to what politically had been going on before this time. So from the 900s all the way to the 1200s, Turkish warrior dynasties had periodically and regularly taken control of Islam's eastern lands and converted to Islam after their conquests. And, as nomadic conquerors without a building tradition of their own, they sponsored monuments based on, long-standing pre-Islamic Persian traditional architecture, relying obviously on local architects and stonemasons. But then, during the early 1200s, Genghis Khan unleashed his Mongolian hordes throughout this region, slaughtering all who did not surrender to his empire and devastating every city that put up resistance. And so Genghis Khan's sons and grandsons, who in turn ruled this region, did not convert to Islam, but the 3rd generation of the Khanate ruling class finally became Muslim. And these Mongol descended dynasties that rose throughout this region sponsored new cities, palaces, gardens, and funerary domes after the model of Western Islamic lands. But after Genghis Khan's descendants had declined in power, Timur, a general of Mongolian and Turkic origin, filled the vacuum and conquered most of Central Asia himself. And this is the man you see on the slide, also known as Tamerlane or Timur the Lame. And in so doing, he created this empire that stretched all the way from Baghdad to Delhi in India. And Timur is infamous for his cruelty. He's known to have beheaded thousands of resistors and constructed pyramids out of the very skulls of his victims. But he was also one of the world's greatest architectural patrons. So one of the first things Timur did after his conquest was rebuild the ancient city of Samarkand, demolished more than a century ago by the Mongols, and it would become his showcase artistic capital. And like the Khans, he and his court actually preferred to live outside the city in yurts, those Mongolian tents we talked about in the first class. Yet he still created a great palace to host diplomatic events, as well as stone mosques, a massive covered market, and tombs for himself and his generals. And in around 1400, Timur commissioned this great public mosque of Samarkand, which you see here, named Bibi Kanyam, after his closest ancestor that traced her lineage directly to Genghis Khan. So with the naming of this mosque, Timur is obviously trying to very strongly associate himself as a direct descendant of Genghis Khan. And the construction of this mosque very clearly celebrated the recent addition of northern India to his empire, and that's because it was made with tons and tons of Indian marble. And so here, hundreds of elephants actually dragged hundreds of tons of marble from India, including solid marble columns, for use in the mosque's hypo-style prayer hall to Samarkand. And Islam in Central Asia throughout the medieval period was often sort of folkloristic and unorthodox, kind of blending with local Persian, Iranian, Parthian, and Indian religions. And so the form of surviving mosques itself in this region then tellingly originated from Parthian and Zoroastrian temples, these ancient pre-Islamic religions of the region, which focused on open-air ceremonies in an open court, usually by burning animal and plant-based sacrifices. So these Central Asian mosques typically emphasize these Zoroastrian open courtyards from their old religious traditions. But this was also pragmatic. The Mosque of Samarkand, with its 3 domed rooms, covered galleries, and massive open courtyard in the center, was intended to gather the entire male population of Samarkand with Friday prayers. and Timur and his court might have occupied the domed room that housed the mihrab and the maksura during their prayers. But you'll notice something else very distinctive about this mosque, these massive monumental gateways in. These are called iwans. So iwans are essentially these oversized vaulted gateways into a mosque. And this motif, invented by Islamic Central Asia, is now a very common sight in Islamic architecture as an entrance to a palace or mosque. But the form is actually pre-Islamic as well in origin, as you will see these also in pre-Islamic Parthian and Zoroastrian temples, though usually these had round arches instead of the Islamic pointed arch. And the iwans were originally found in these Zoroastrian or Parthian temples as 4 vaulted gates that would open into a central courtyard. But now they were given new innovations in the Islamic era. They were coated in blue and green glazed tiles, like traditional Zoroastrian temples, but now only in geometric patterns, floral motifs, and Kufic script from the words of the Quran. So in classical Islamic tradition, no idolatry was allowed, meaning no pictures of humans or animals. At the other end of Samarkand, Timur planned his mausoleum fortuitously on the year of his death, 1405. This tomb doubled as actually an open courtyard mosque with Persian column minarets at each corner, and to the east stood a religious college inspired by the Ottoman Emirates. The Safavid Empire rose up at the end of the 1500s in Persia as Timur's empire fell disastrously apart, partitioned between his infighting sons and dissolved entirely by civil wars. And so the Safavids, inheriting Timur's subjects, tried to keep pace with the monumental achievements of Timur. They repeated these blue and green tiled open court mosques used throughout Persia at the center of their cities, surrounded by tiled public markets and lush gardens, creating, according to some, paradise on earth. And they built massive domed iwans, the largest in the world, and open courtyard mosques with massive pools at their center for purification. Indeed, their iwans were so massive that they actually housed multiple stories of religious colleges inside. Their minarets, though, were inspired by Ottoman pencil minarets, coming to a point with ambulating balconies below. And to top it all off, they built some of the largest pointed Islamic domes in the world as glimmering emblems of their power. Meanwhile, far to the west in Europe, Spain and France had surpassed Italy in the 1600s to become the dominant powers in Europe, but the architectural models continued to come from Italy. The Roman Catholic Church here remained central to all 3 regions, launching a counter-reformation in 1563 to undermine the newfound Protestant Reformation. This included founding new religious orders, training missionaries to defend the Catholic faith at home in Europe, and preach to far-flung colonies, expanding their parishes and founding new religious colleges. Above all, Catholicism promoted a very theatrical approach in its architecture as, the antithesis of whitewashed Protestant churches to stimulate the enthusiasm of the faithful not to turn to Protestantism. This ushered in the Baroque era, which was originally introduced by the Catholic Church as a means to, combat the Reformation and Protestant Church with a new architecture that inspired passion and awe. So Baroque architects took the basic elements of Renaissance architecture, including domes and colonnades, and made them higher, grander, more colorful, more decorated, more three-dimensional, and more dramatic. So, Baroque architects here often combined painting and sculpture with a type of Renaissance classical architecture that broke the rules. Columns were often twisted, pediments were broken, church walls themselves undulated and broke from the orthogonal grid. Clusters of sculpted and painted angels often crowd the ceilings and domes of Baroque churches, giving the illusion that one is looking into the heavens. Many surfaces were gilded. So in this second third of the class, we'll be talking about the lead up to the proper Baroque era, as the Catholic Church outside of Italy sort of had all of a sudden a bit of an identity crisis and starkly changed its image from the Gothic to the Baroque. Before the Baroque era began, Michelangelo's plastic Renaissance style established at St. Peter's Basilica really spread like wildfire around Europe as the appropriate Catholic architecture. And Spain was the first to adopt it with open arms. Now, Spain, had prided itself on being the most Catholic nation because it had succumbed the least to the Protestant movement as a result of the Spanish Inquisition. And so they were the first Catholic nation outside of Italy to break away from the Gothic and implement Michelangelo's style in their churches and palaces. And at this time, in the late 1500s, the Habsburg dynasty, the ruling house of Spain, through marriage alliances, collectively owned the most widespread lands throughout Europe in Italy, Austria, Germany, Burgundy, and the Netherlands. As a result, they became the most dominant military power in Europe. And so their wealth from these European possessions and their new colonies in the Americas allowed them to raise the level of well-being in many Spanish cities. So as I said, Spain was the first Catholic nation outside of Italy to break away from the Gothic and implement Michelangelo's style in their churches and palaces. So Philip II, the successor of Charles V and founder of the Habsburgs, favored the classical style of Renaissance Rome to showcase, Spain's enthusiasm for the style and support for the new face of the Catholic Church. So he built the monastery of San Lorenzo to serve as the Habsburgs' principal monastery and dynastic burial site and to showcase this new style Spain was adopting. He also intended it to be, the antithesis of the Muslim palaces still surviving in Spain, which he deemed as overly ornate and gaudy. And so he proposed what he called the undecorated style in solid blocks of granite, this more stripped down version of the flamboyance of St. Peter's to reflect the, undistracted piety of the Habsburgs. He believed that, the correct use of classicism in architecture encouraged correct attitudes in both religion and government. And so to design it, he hired Juan Bautista, who worked very closely with Michelangelo's on St. Peter's, so he's literally hiring from the source. And this architect designed the monastery as a very strict gridded plan representing St. Lawrence's symbol of the grill. He was that 2nd century martyr to be cooked alive on a grill. So a very sort of clever reference here. And so the monastery started with this grand domed church in the center, surrounded by courtyards housing a royal mausoleum, a monastery for 100 monks, a religious college, a palace for the king's court to stay, and a hospital. And the western entry facade here was designed just like St. Peter's with a temple front supported by half Ionic columns. The central dome of the church directly imitated Michelangelo's at St. Peter's, rising as this ribbed lead dome on a tall drum and buttressed by paired columns, just like Michelangelo's dome. And beneath this all sat the Habsburg crypt, the mausoleum, the burial mausoleum of the Habsburg dynasty, which lay directly beneath the altar of the church. So Philip II then had established a new vision of the Catholic order, very distinct from the ornate Gothic and Islamic styles of the Spanish past. The Habsburgs also brought a similar sense of order with minimal decoration to their public projects. So after a fire in Madrid, for example, this new plaza was built in 1590 as a gift from the Habsburgs. And it kind of imitated the arcaded markets popular in Ottoman cities. And so eager to sort of revive their own Roman origins, the Habsburgs built their own plaza and trading market enclosed by these regular arcades. And above them, 4 floors with regularly placed windows housed merchants' apartments and businesses. The bakery here was topped with these signature Habsburg pointed spires to mark out the Habsburgs as the clear, munificent patrons. During the second half of the 1500s, France was torn by civil wars between Protestants and Catholics. When Henry IV ascended the French throne, he had favored Protestantism initially, but in 1593 converted to Catholicism in the interests of national unity as the majority of France was Catholic. And during his reign, France really surpassed Spain as a European power, so Henry began to replan medieval Paris as a new symbol of France's newfound power. And so France in the 1600s, you can imagine, was one of the largest but worst kept cities in Europe, with a tangle of medieval streets and no public spaces. And so Henry's renewal program included rebuilding the palace at the Louvre, enlarging and straightening the medieval streets, adding public squares and gardens, building hospitals, and building new bridges across Paris's river, the Seine. And his most famous bridge here straddles the island of the city, the famous original site which Paris expanded out from. And so most of the new ecclesiastical buildings, most of the new churches founded around New Paris under Henry IV's reign took the style of Renaissance and Baroque Rome. So this church is great to look at for this tradition because it began actually as a Gothic church all the way back in the 1400s, but finished in 1626 in the new Catholic Baroque style. On the facade on the front, it carried this classical temple front held up by rusticated half columns holding this triangular pediment, much like, Andrea Palladio's Renaissance churches. But the church front, characteristically Baroque, broke classical rules ever so slightly with a two-level temple facade. Above this first temple facade rose a second level with two aedicules framing saints in the style of Michelangelo, topped by this broken round pediment framing a Gothic rose window. This amazing, amalgamation of styles set directly in between the Gothic and the Baroque era. And then again on this steep Gothic roof, a Michelangelo-style aedicule window frame was placed. Indeed, the bell tower was finished not with a Gothic spire, but with a classical Renaissance lantern similar to the one found on the dome of St. Peter's Basilica. But the rest of the church, finished much earlier, was wholly Gothic with ribbed vaults and flying buttresses, so you could call this a Gothic Baroque church. The very first hemispherical dome of Paris's skyline, you'll notice a simplified copy of St. Peter's, went up with the rebuilding of the University of Paris, their Sorbonne, in 1626. And this church broke classical rules ever so slightly with this two-level temple facade again, a temple front of Corinthian half columns held up another with Corinthian pilasters. And so while Gothic buttresses and spires had really been the highest expression of religious architecture in Paris in the past, these new Catholic churches were marked by classical columns, temple fronts with pediments, and rounded domes, which all, confirmed them as supporters of Papal Rome's Counter-Reformation. But as if to maintain, some semblance with the old Gothic spires of the past, very familiar to France, medieval France, these new Catholic architects in Paris often topped the corners of their churches with the statues of saints, very, reminiscent of the spires coming out of buttresses and gargoyles coming out of Gothic rooflines. But the interior here is very much sticking to, the classic Renaissance interior, gray tone, but full of the Baroque plasticity or three-dimensionality that is very characteristic of this age in its, pilasters, dentils, and wrapped entablature. And this convent church is just another really great example of the new Catholic style of Paris, somewhere between, Renaissance and Baroque at this point, very reminiscent of St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, with this double pedimented temple front and its lead roof dome with these dormer windows. And finally, during the long reign of Louis XIV, the true Baroque style emerged. This new royal palace he built in the countryside west of Paris kept him safe from the dangers of the city center. France had this history of the nobility frequently rising up against the royals and starting a new dynasty. So King Louis, in attempt to minimize this, required all the great nobility of France to come live with him at Versailles for at least part of the year. This, had the effect of reducing one major threat to his power, the nobility. So, by requiring them to come live with him for part of the year, he really secured his nobles' cooperation. And once settled at Versailles, Louis rarely returned to Paris. So by the end of the 1600s, around 1,500 nobles and their retinues lived at Versailles with Louis XIV. And so the palace became this kind of immense social experiment where the nobility of France lived for much of the year in their own bubble, really out of touch with the rest of the world, entertained by dining halls, billiard rooms, immense gardens, a theater, and their own church. And so thus Louis was called very famously the Sun King, because all the nobility at his palace were to rise when he rose and go to bed when he went to bed. And his palace occupied the center of this radiating pattern of streets. They radiated on one side to the town of Versailles, where the nobility were to live, and on the other side to acres and acres of great gardens. And so Louis's architects here decorated the brick facade of his palace with marble columns, gilded balconies, and regularly placed marble busts, truly three-dimensional and overly gaudy. The king's apartment was at the exact center of it all, at the center of the palace, and everything was to radiate from him. Another reason why he was called the Sun King. He was literally positioned at the center of these radiating streets, just like the rays of the sun. The rear of the building was wrapped in this white limestone with a rusticated base, just like a Renaissance palace, articulated with, pilasters and 3 protruding Ionic porches. And just inside here was the famous Hall of Mirrors, this brilliantly painted gilded gallery for quickly strolling from one end of the palace to the other, lined with 17 full-length mirrors, these amazingly expensive things in 17th century France. But even above the Hall of Mirrors, Louis personally believed that his gardens were the top showpiece of his estate. He was obsessively involved in their plans, much more than the architecture, and he personally wrote his own guidebook for visiting them. And so these French gardens established by Louis, unlike, the Chinese scholar gardens, imposed this geometric order on the landscape. French gardeners were much more concerned with showing how they could tame nature, not appreciate its natural chaos. And directly south of the palace was this garden of orange trees, where gardeners cared for these hundreds of orange trees. In fact, every morning one was brought to the king's bed so he could personally pick the fruit. Zoom out from these gardens and you'll see a cruciform canal split the great gardens in two, and this was actually large enough to test prototype ships for the Royal Navy. In 1685, Hardouin Mansart designed some of these apartment buildings of the nobility to the north of the palace, with this equestrian statue of Louis at the center. He designed the facades with these arches for shops at the ground level and these Ionic pilasters articulating the upper 2 stories. But the roofs had these very characteristic new dormer windows that extended the space vertically 1 or 2 more stories. And so this made, even the roof space habitable. And so while Hardouin Mansart did not invent the mansard roof, he popularized it here, so they are called mansard roofs in his honor. And these are, of course, the types of roof that came to be put on the Baroque apartment buildings all across Paris. Meanwhile, Gian Lorenzo Bernini, that Baroque architect who had finished St. Peter's in the Baroque style, we briefly touched on last class, dominated at Rome at this time as the most sought after architect. He was also a famous playwright and set designer, and so blended his, theatrical interest with his architecture. So this theatrical background of Bernini is shown in the design of the Cornaro Chapel inside the Church of Santa Maria della Vittoria. And Bernini was very deeply religious, but he was also, as I said, interested in theater. He did set designs, he wrote plays, and his theatrical approach to architecture was, as you can imagine, greatly favored by the Catholic Church as, a method to capture the emotions of potential converts to Protestantism. He brought together his religious faith and set design in the ecstasy of St. Teresa here, this chapel, to inspire faith in modern miracles, something which Protestants were then dismissing outside of Jesus. And the subject matter here is St. Teresa, this Spanish nun who had recently been made a saint, canonized in 1622, who here is shown having one of her reported accounts of a vision of an angel. and in this vision, an angel reportedly plunged a spear or arrow into her heart several times, but left her not with physical pain, but a feeling of the true love of God for humanity. And you'll notice here that the very altar that holds these statues bows outward toward us, just like a theater's stage between these paired columns. And on either side of the chapel, as if to drive home the theater reference, he's placed sculptures of members of the Cornaro family. The patrons paying for this chapel in box seats as if they were observing St. Teresa's performance on the stage. And so Bernini, makes this Baroque by using a broken pediment to emphasize the miracle literally breaking into our world, dramatically, invading the viewer's space. And above, he's added painted angels and floating boards of clouds in front of the window, all crowding the ceiling of the chapel, surrounding the white dove of the Holy Spirit. This, in turn, was surrounded by miniature statues of more angels, making it all look as if the very courts of heaven were watching this moment. And to heighten the miraculous appearance of it all, Bernini even built this secret chimney-like light trap to charge the sculptures with this, seemingly miraculous light coming from nowhere. So, Bernini is doing everything he can to make us feel this moment, this spiritual vision. Baroque art appeals to our senses. This is the Baroque art peddled by the new Catholic Church. They want to stir the emotions of those considering Protestantism. They want to bring Protestants back to the Catholic Church by making Christianity moving and emotional again. This is because, Protestantism abhors decorations, abhors the saints and miracles in favor of studying scripture alone and a personal relationship with God. So Bernini is here trying to kind of stir the emotions of potential deserters to the Catholic Church by saying, there are miracles and saints even in our own times. Do you not feel a relationship with God in this very chapel? The divine crosses over here where glory is given to God, not like in Protestant churches. Bernini also built his own entire churches. This is one of his most famous, this Church of St. Andrew in Rome. It had, this temple front facade with two colossal Corinthian pilasters, very Baroque, supporting a pediment made Baroque by breaking the rules of classicism and arching the entablature into the viewer's space into this kind of semicircular canopy and porch. Meanwhile, on the inside, you see this kind of reduced version of the Pantheon with this Baroque addition of marble sculpted angels that fitted around the trim of the lantern, as if, hailing St. Andrew as he ascended on a cloud through a very Baroque broken pediment over the altar. This is all very dramatic and three-dimensional. Saints are no longer frescoes, mosaics, or stained glass in 2 dimensions, but now statues that invade the viewer's space in 3 dimensions. Borromini, the rival of Bernini, pushed beyond the conventions of classical architecture. He bent many more rules than Bernini, and this is best seen in his famous church in Rome, the Church of San Carlino. The entry porch here is not actually a traditional temple front, but sort of a facade framed with, a grid of aedicules, balustrades, and columns, and it is all, very dramatically undulating. It curves in, then out, then back in again, and this undulation is continued on the inside. The church is made of this kind of modest whitewashed plaster, but it is an undulating oval in plan, forcing it to be topped with this unorthodox oval-shaped dome set on these kind of irregular pendentives. And the very coffers on the inside of the oval are sort of sponge-like or kaleidoscope-like and diminish in size as they reach the lantern at the top, making for, a very, very captivating, moving, and emotional space of worship. Finally, in the last third of class, we're going to have a look at feudal and post-feudal Japan, this region we've really been avoiding because much of Japan's architecture before this era is kind of hard to analyze since, much like China, it was rebuilt in wood every few generations. So the Edo period here is really the most recent period where we start to sort of see more permanent architecture that survives, and the first flourishing of a sort of renaissance in Japanese architecture. So let's quickly catch you up with some historical background. So at the end of the 1500s, after several centuries of civil wars, Japan achieved a national unity under this succession of shoguns, or these powerful military leaders who brought an end to the feudal age. The last shogun, Tokugawa Ieyasu, established this long-term hereditary dynasty. But since all the way back in 1100, Japan had an emperor, but his rule was mostly religious and symbolic. The country's real power was actually dissipated between daimyo, these 262 feudal lords of Japan. And from their number, occasionally a supreme military leader or shogun periodically kind of gained sway through his valor in the field. And these shogun, like in the West, each had a personal retinue or elite guard force of loyal knights called samurai. And so with the rise of these, very powerful and wealthy shoguns ruling Japan for the first time as a unified nation, they began to successively mark their rule in stone, specifically by building castles. And in these castles, we can, look at Japanese architecture which endures to the current day. So in the late 1500s, the shoguns began to turn away from their, very ephemeral wooden palaces and houses of old Japan and began to build castles with stone bases as permanent symbols of their authority, topped by these multi-level wooden towers known as tenshu. And only 12 tenshu have survived, but the shoguns and their followers had built nearly 100 tenshu, it's reported, between 1576 and 1634. These were these wooden palatial towers on these steeply pitched stone bases, usually built on hills or cliffs for added protection. And these Japanese architects really developed these stone castles after guns were introduced by Portuguese traders in the mid 1500s. Ascending the raised stone bases on an inaccessible hill really broke up ranks of soldiers armed with guns, forcing, the closer combat the samurai were used to. But the tenshu towers themselves, apart from their castle bases, had very little military function. They merely kind of symbolized the power, wealth, and extravagance of the castle's owner. And so Nobunaga, one of the strongest feudal lords at the time, built the first tenshu around 1576. His enemies actually destroyed it after his assassination in 1582, but the stone base of course survives, as well as drawings and written depictions, which you see here. It sat on this 22-meter high pyramidal stone base made of cyclopean stones, these interlocking boulders carved to fit like puzzle pieces without mortar. Meanwhile, Nobunaga's master shipbuilder was said to design the tower itself, which rose 5 levels on these interconnected wooden frames. The final shogun to complete the total unification of Japan, Tokugawa Ieyasu, withdrew from the old imperial city of Kyoto and transformed the small fishing village of Edo, now known as Tokyo, into his own capital city. And his tenshu, his tower, rose a staggering 60 meters high above the rest of the city fabric, surrounded by 2 inner moats and dozens of palace structures. It was the tallest in Japan, but sadly succumbed to a fire in 1657. But similar to Louis XIV at Versailles, Ieyasu attempted to control the nobility by requiring them to build a palace in his capital city as well and spend every other year in residence there. And so allegedly over 60% of Edo's territory in the 1600s was occupied by these palaces, but today only 2 palatial gardens remain intact from this age, with the rest of the old city fabric being replaced. Himeji Castle is the largest and best preserved of these surviving tenshus, built by a trusted friend and ally of Tokugawa Ieyasu. It was guarded by this labyrinthine series of cyclopean walls with 84 gatehouse towers, all surrounded by a massive moat. And here the upper, wooden stories of the castle were built with these mortise and tenon wood beams joined to two strong vertical masts, extending the entire height of the structure kind of like a spine. So, in this way, the construction method really resembled the structure of a tree, making it very flexible and able to sort of sway with the moving of the earth. And so, it's very telling that since this was built like a tree, it really has withstood the test of time and all of the earthquakes that have hit Japan. But after 1615, after crushing the final resistant daimyo in Japan, Ieyasu made a law to limit competition between future daimyo, forbidding daimyo to possess more than one castle per region. So the majority of Japanese nobles continued to live in simple palaces on the ground. And so in earlier periods, for most of feudal Japanese history, these Japanese palaces had really derived from Chinese palaces. They had this very obvious central reception hall with an entrance on the long side, surrounded by porches like those seen in the imperial city, then with living spaces after crossing raised platforms or bridges to either side. During this Edo period, though, a new palace type broke from these Chinese precedents, and the plan followed this kind of staggered series of pavilions in a sort of zigzag pattern meant to, increase exposure to a man-made garden landscape inspired by Ming China's scholar gardens. So this Ninumaro Palace in Kyoto, for example, built by Ieyasu in 1610 and enlarged in 1626 by his grandson, is the best preserved example of this type. This was essentially a palace away from his home court in Tokyo, meant for meeting with the emperor during his stays in Kyoto, the nominal and traditional capital of Japan. And again, remember, the Emperor of Japan at this point is very symbolic, but holds no real power, a bit like the royal family today in England. So let's walk you through arriving here, what you would have seen and the customs expected of you. So you would have entered kind of off axis through this small covered hall on the far southeast corner and proceeded through these enclosed verandas, these outdoor covered porches on the southern and western perimeters of the halls. And to your left, sliding shutters opened these corridors to stunning but forced views of heavily manicured lakes and gardens. And these verandas linking the 5 halls actually had floorboards that purposely squeaked as one passed to alert the occupants of any intruders. And as you guessed it, the roofs were all held up, as in the traditional Chinese palace buildings, by wooden columns, allowing the walls to bear no weight, allowing the walls to be made of what's called painted fusuma panels, or these painted cardboard panels. And so nearly all of the rooms in the palace were divided into by these painted fusuma panels, these cardboard panels, with servant spaces to the east and royal courts and suites to the west. And so these fusuma panels, as you can imagine, could be slid open anywhere to connect the servant spaces with the royal courts for serving food and tea, but then shut again to produce a seamless wall, segregating the servants and the nobility once again. And these fusuma panels boasted lavish quantities of gold leaf and elaborate wood carvings on their faces, intended to, impress visitors with the power and wealth of the shogun in this case. But outside of this, the palace was made to appear very minimal and not excessively decorated, as Japanese culture at this time deeply, deeply valued humility. And all the floors within these chambers were made of what's called tatami mats, these woven rush mats with cloth borders, very easy on the knees for kneeling on, the custom way to sit in Japan at this time. And they were all roughly 1 by 2 meters, the size of a sleeping space. And so, these mats could tell you how many people a room could fit at maximum capacity, so it was very, very easy to design room sizes based on the ceremonies that were supposed to occur in them. And just like in Mesopotamian palaces, which we learned about way in the beginning of this class, unless you were an intimate of the shogun, you couldn't really progress very far into this palace. Most visitors were received in the very outer regions of the palace where, these short receptions could be had or tributes could be left for the shogun, whereas higher ranking visitors, really only the emperor, his courtiers, or the shogun's direct family and intimates were shown into the deeper recesses of the palace. So, for example, the shogun reserved the fourth hall, the Ohiroma, for the reception of the emperor. And I remind you, this is really the whole point of this palace, for the shogun to travel to Kyoto to meet with the emperor and stay in this palace as sort of his home away from home. So here in this very room, he would meet with the emperor and his court to discuss national issues, kind of symbolically paying respects and homage to the emperor, even though he himself held the real power. To make things very obvious, this room was decorated with twisted pine trees, the very symbol of the emperor. But there was no question about who held the real power here. For these formal receptions, the shogun sat on the upper level of the north end of the hall, cross-legged and on a slightly raised mat, but alone to show humility, while the emperor and his court entered and sat before him as an audience while servants brought in tea. And just as one needed to show, humility during life, one's successors needed to honor them after death. So the burial sites of shoguns were some of the most elaborately decorated structures in Edo Japan, and some of the structures that architects could really play around with artistically because they didn't have to stick to the humble aesthetic required in palaces. These shoguns were often deified after their deaths, and so their successors often built these very ornate temples for the worship of their spirits. But the major decorative buildings at a shogun's shrine were these gates forming the precinct to their inner sanctuary where their spirit is supposed to reside, with their multiple brackets, ornate sculptures, and delicate metalworks. And so beyond this gate, this very restrained stone pagoda stood like those of Buddhist saints. Essentially, the shoguns here are marking their tombs to visitors as very clear pilgrimage sites like the shrines of Buddhist apostles and saints, implying their, divine holiness, implying, they expect their spirits to be worshipped. Using, this religious symbolism very well known throughout the East.